You're watching an amazing podcast from an amazing podcast company.
Hello, Mob Talk associates. Johnny Chechitelli here, James Naples, host of Youngstown Mob Talk. And as you can see, we're joined by a very special guest. Vince Guerrieri is in the house. How you doing, Vince?
Good. How about you?
We're doing great. How about you, Jim?
I'm doing fantastic. How about you?
Yeah, everything's going well, man. We got a lot more episodes coming out for you guys. Today, obviously, we have an interview here with Vince. If you guys don't know who Vince is, great writer, a very celebrated writer. He is from Youngstown originally, and you probably recognize that name, Guerrieri. A lot of people always comment, "Oh, is he related to this Guerrieri or that Guerrieri?" So we'll talk about that in a minute. But
the short answer is yes.
Yeah. Vince is also, you might recognize him from the Vice Squad podcast. This is another podcast that we do. We put 6 episodes out there so far. These are different style than Mob Talk. It's not a chat show. It's more of a documentary style essay kind of thing that we do. We also have Vince Guerrieri is a writer. James is a producer. I'm a producer. And Rick Porello is a producer and a writer as well. So true crime author Rick Porello. So check out the Vice Squad pod. That is available on YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get amazing podcasts, you'll be able to find the Vice Squad podcast. So real quick, Vince, give us your background. Tell the folks at home, the bio, if you will, for Vince Guerrieri.
I'm a complicated man and no one understands me but my woman. No, wait, that's Shaft. I am, as you said, a Youngstown native, grew up on the West Side, went to Cheney. Worked as a journalist, still working as a journalist for a variety of news outlets. I was in Pittsburgh for a while. When I was in college, I was summer help at the Tribune Chronicle in Warren. I'm currently outside of Cleveland. I have an office job for the Chronicle Telegram in Elyria, and I write on the side for anybody who will have me.
That's awesome. So, if you guys haven't watched the Vice Squad podcast, we do a very visual kind of style with that show. Vince sits at the old detective's desk. He's got the fedora, the cigar, and all that cool stuff. So we really
very dimly lit too, which works well for me.
Yeah, very, very noir style. So, you can always listen to our podcast anywhere that you get your podcast, but we do encourage to check out the YouTube channel because at least then you'll be able to see and, so many great pictures and everything. Let's get into it real quick. Let's talk about the Vice Squad pod. Vince wrote several of the episodes we did in our first batch there.
And I got a couple more in the can. So hopefully we'll have new episodes to you before too long.
Yeah. So those episodes, what do you want to start with? Let's say you did one on Jimmy Munsene.
I did. And it was actually a really interesting story. Organized crime, as we know, organized crime was really born of Prohibition. Which was obviously the period in the 1920s when the sale of alcohol was illegal in the United States. Jimmy Munsene was actually sort of I would say, a proto-gangster. It does not seem like he was affiliated with any kind of larger organization, but he had, obviously he had a restaurant that had a gambling casino in it, just south of downtown Warren. He was involved in some bootlegging apparently as well. Like I said, he had some gambling interests. He's probably best known for a series of bribery trials. There was an allegation that he bribed the Trumbull County Sheriff. He went to trial. I think they did a total of 5 trials because they kept getting mistrials declared. But what was really funny is for, I think, the last trial or the last 2 trials of his lawyer was Clarence Darrow, who was actually a Trumbull County native. He was born in Kinsman, left Trumbull County because the story was that he had a landlady who would not rent him a home because she didn't think he was going to amount to anything. So he went off and became one of the most celebrated trial lawyers of his day. He was an attorney at the Scopes Monkey trial. He was an attorney for Leopold and Loeb, and he says, I've never won a case in my home county, so I'm going to come back to Warren and defend Jimmy Munsene.
Now, real quick, if you guys aren't aware, especially the younger generations here, Clarence Darrow, one of the most celebrated lawyers, people who know law really respect Clarence Darrow.
Sure.
Clarence Darrow, I think there's some movies out. He's appeared in a few movies as characters.
Inherit the Wind. The Inherit the Wind was based on the Scopes monkey trial, and he was the lawyer that Spencer Tracy portrayed in the original version of it.
So yeah, definitely one of the most famous lawyers of the 20th century, Clarence Darrow, from right here in the Mahoning Valley. And so again, pick it back up. He comes back. He wants to try a case in Trumbull County, so he gets his taste of a mob, or I don't want to say a mob trial, but a gangster trial.
Right, and he does that, and he is not able to successfully defend Jimmy Munsene because another mistrial is declared, and not long after that, the stock market crashed, and Clarence Darrow had visions that this was going to be his final trial, and then he would slide off into retirement. And all of a sudden, his investments all went belly up, and he suddenly needed more money. So he moved on to some other things. But eventually, Jimmy Munsene pleaded guilty after like 5 trials, and he was fined like $500 or something like that. It was really kind of absurd the way that played out. But
years and years of trial after trial after trial, and in the end, he just gets basically a slap on the wrist and a fine.
Mm-hmm. And he had kind of his day had kind of run its course as well. And he ended up he owned a dog track out at Craig Beach near Lake Milton. And he was actually shot and killed in his restaurant in, I believe, 1939.
Yeah, that was the Prime Steakhouse,
correct,
out in Warren. So definitely,
and that building ended up being like the rescue mission in Warren for a while, and I believe it burned down in the 70s.
Yeah, 2 gunmen, I believe, they were hired guns out of like Detroit or something. They came in, did it. They killed him and his nephew, Felix Monfrino. But that's all, check out that episode of the Vice Squad podcast, everybody. And Jimmy Munsene, the last thing we'll talk about real quick about him, in case you're wondering, that name, Jimmy Munsene, that wasn't obviously his name. His name was James Mancini. No relation to Boom Boom, but that was James Mancini. And, his name just kind of got shortened in the conversational terms of Munsene, and then he stuck with it, Jimmy Munsene. So big Jimmy. And, when he died, hundreds of people went to the funeral. It was a pretty huge deal here. And yeah, definitely a great episode though of the Vice Squad podcast. So, he also Vince went on to write another couple episodes. You did one on Alvin Karpis in the great train robbery, the last great train robbery.
And what's really interesting, and I thought about this in light of the postal carrier that got shot recently
in Warren, yeah.
But one of the things that Karpis did before that is he robbed a mail truck, and one of the things that happens there is that's the kind of crime that, and this is an element of law enforcement that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. I certainly wasn't before I, covered a similar case when I was in Pittsburgh in the early 2000s. But there is a whole legion of postal inspectors. The U.S. Postal Service has its own investigative branch and law enforcement branch. And they're the ones that led the charge for the investigation into the mail truck robbery. And it was kind of funny because Karpis ended up being arrested for the train robbery. And if he had gone to trial instead for the mail robbery, his sentence probably would have been far shorter than it ended up being.
Wow.
Because he ended up being the longest tenured inmate at Alcatraz.
Wow. And Creepy Karpis is what they called him. Alvin Karpis was a really interesting character. This is around the John Dillinger era, that what do they call it? The Midwest crime wave. And he robbed this train in Garrettsville, which was, correct me if I'm wrong, had something to do with the payroll for the steel workers around town?
The train came from Cleveland, and that's where they got the payroll from the Federal Reserve Bank in downtown Cleveland. And I believe he thought it would have the payroll for both Republic Steel and Sheet and Tube. It only had the payroll for Republic Steel, but it was still a pretty good haul. I think they got away with like $80,000.
Wow, in those days, yeah.
That's a lot of money back then.
And you know,
it's a decent amount of money now.
yeah.
It's true.
Karpis was just fascinating character. Like you said, he's longest serving inmate at Alcatraz. He actually served time with Charles Manson at one point, right? Didn't he?
After Alcatraz closed, he ended up at another prison. I think it was in Washington State. We're talking like the early to mid 60s. And he actually taught Charles Manson how to play the guitar.
Oh man, he's setting in motion maybe some horrible events. But yeah, creepy Karpis, definitely a character. Great, another great episode.
And Alvin Karpis was actually he did security for a while. These guys all had relatively nomadic existences, and he did security for a while at the Harvard Inn. And we talk at some length. I know one of the other episodes I did was on the Jungle Inn, but there were places like that all the way throughout northern Ohio. There was the Mounds Club and the Pettibone Club in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland and Lake and Geauga County. There was obviously the Jungle Inn in Trumbull County, and the Harvard Club was just outside the Cleveland city limits on Harvard Avenue. And he actually did security there. And one of the first things that Eliot Ness did as the public safety director in Cleveland, along with Frank Lausch, who was a judge at the time, ended up getting elected governor in the late 1940s. But they made it a point to try and close down the Harvard Club.
Yeah,
I mean, they didn't, but they sure tried.
When I did a little research on Alvin Karpis, there was a island up in Lake Erie that sits right close to the Canadian U.S. border, and they actually turned it into one of those gambling dens.
Mm-hmm.
They had a house built on it and the whole 9 yards. Well, he would go when he would hide from the cops. That's where he would go.
Mm-hmm.
And
which island was that? Rattlesnake?
I think it is Rattlesnake Island.
Rattlesnake Island is actually now a privately owned island. They have a very exclusive club there. But, it's kind of funny because that whole corner of the universe, because of its proximity to Detroit and Canada and Cleveland, is just shot through with all of these stories about, bootlegging and mob involvement. And unfortunately, you're never sure what's legend and what's fact.
Right. But I just thought it was interesting. That was one of the places he would go hide out.
You mentioned Eliot Ness a little bit. Now, he factors into another episode you wrote of the Vice Squad podcast about the torso killings, I should say, up in Cleveland from Pittsburgh to Newcastle, Youngstown, and Cleveland. There were all of these murders, these mostly unsolved murders in, what was it, from the 1920s to the early 40s, if I'm not.
Well, there's this concept, anytime you're talking about a spree killer like this, there's this concept of the canonical murders. Like when they talk about Jack the Ripper, they talk about these 5 murders in Whitechapel in a several month span, and the murders that are officially credited to the torso killer, the Mad Butcher at Kingsbury Row, whatever you want to call them. There are, I believe, a dozen that are attributed to him, and these were body parts that had turned up throughout Cleveland in, I want to say, about a 5-year span in the mid to late 1930s. But one of the detectives that actually investigated this, he said that he believed that there were quite possibly another dozen people that fell victim to this particular killer. His operating theory was that it was a killer who rode the rails. And in fact, there were bodies that were found in boxcars in McKees Rocks, which is right outside of Pittsburgh. And it was believed that those boxcars had come from Youngstown. So it is possible that, the torso killer was plying his trade in the Youngstown area as well.
Yeah, it's definitely right in that middle of that stretch there from Pittsburgh to Cleveland. And, back then, if you were riding the rails, I couldn't imagine, how dangerous it was. First of all, you always see the that kind of old cartoon representation of like the hobos on the train rails.
Mm-hmm.
And then the older I get, the more research I did on that era. And holy cow,
That's terrifying.
Horrible stuff that happened on those train rails. Oh my, you didn't want to be a teenage runaway.
But there were obviously multiple opportunities to get on that. There was a big New York Central rail yard in Collinwood. There were all kinds of railroad tracks through Kingsbury Row going into downtown and into the flats. Obviously, Pittsburgh has its own rail system. The place in McKees Rocks where those bodies were found was a big roundhouse, and it was everywhere, and it was really easily accessible if you wanted to assess it.
Wow. And you mentioned Eliot Ness. Now, Eliot Ness came from Chicago to Cleveland. He was, of course, made his name in Chicago as the untouchable lawman who took down Al Capone and all that. And his story's been,
which is another good example of a story that may be more myth than fact.
Yeah, it's been widely exaggerated by Hollywood and everything in the movies, but
even the original book, he Eliot Ness had kind of a sad end. He died. He ended up having a drinking problem, and he died essentially broke. But he had put down some of his recollections in concert with a writer by the name of Oscar Frehley, and Frehley took that and kind of ran with it, and it would have been a couple of months after Eliot Ness died that the book The Untouchables came out. Desilu Productions took that and turned it into a television show, and then obviously, like you said, it's taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, I hear they're actually developing another version of it right now for some cable channels. So it's a story that just kind of keeps getting retold and maybe exaggerated even more every time. But I always found it fascinating that he went from Chicago to Cleveland, and he was named the public safety director.
Yes, and at the time, Cleveland had every bit of as bad a reputation as Chicago did. His goal, they wanted him to standardize and professionalize Cleveland's police department. They wanted him to go after, like I said, those illegal gambling facilities like the Harvard Club, and this is one of those things that kind of gets underreported in relation. They wanted him to reduce traffic accidents and traffic deaths, because I guess Cleveland was like one of the deadliest cities in the country in terms of car wrecks, and he did all of that to some extent, but getting the Torso murder was just something that really eluded him, and there are theories out there that kind of broke him.
Yeah, so if there's one thing you guys can take away from this, it's that there have been terrible drivers in Cleveland for over 100 years. So there you go. But no, he never did catch the Torso killer. And you guys can check that episode out. We don't want to beat that one to death here. We'll, that's a great episode to get into. Definitely check out the Torso killings. There's a lot of stuff I had no clue. I learned all about that. And, we always talk about the mob here on Youngstown Mob Talk, and everybody,
it's right there in the name.
Everybody just kind of takes from the 80s up, the 1980s up, and the more of our lifespan, that era. But there's so much history that goes back to the 20s and 30s in this area.
Even before that.
Yeah, but it should not be forgotten. So, we highly encourage you guys to check out the Vice Squad podcast. There's so much history to it. And lastly, we'll get into, an episode that I was, very much looking forward to was the Jungle Inn. So tell us about the jungle. First of all, Jim, what do you remember about the hearing all the stories about the Jungle Inn?
Well, I remember hearing the big one was the guys up in the windows,
turret,
with with the shotgun and Tommy gun, and kind of making sure that there was no riffraff coming in, and they could notify if the cops came, and those type of things. I have a friend that lives over in Monticello Apartments up there in Liberty, and so when I go to his house, I go down Albert Street, Hubbard Road, and then I take Logan Gate down. So I drive past where it used to sit all the time, and I always think when I drive by there, man, what would it be like if that place was still open today?
Yeah,
legal.
Yeah.
So tell us about this episode.
Sure. Like I said, that every area in Northern Ohio had, their own facility like it, but the Jungle Inn kind of stood apart. Liquor licenses, then as now, were apportioned based on population, and the a bunch of people decided they were going to incorporate their own municipality in Trumbull County, and they did so, Hall's Corners, just so they could get this liquor license. But in doing so, they also did something really interesting. They made a municipality that was virtually untouchable. They had their own police force. They had their own police force, but they could not be, you know, there was no other law enforcement agency that could come in there unless they were invited, and they were not invited.
And they were right outside, if you guys know Liberty, right outside of Youngstown city limits, essentially. So, Chief Eddie Allen, who was the police chief in Youngstown, was a reforming police chief at that time, a very hard-nosed cop for a reforming mayor. He had no jurisdiction.
No, he didn't. And in fact, it was in Trumbull County. So, I mean, he had no jurisdiction. The Trumbull County Sheriff had various stages of indifference to the Jungle Inn, depending on who was the sheriff. And Ohio has no state police force. The Ohio Highway Patrol, at the time, their main duty was traffic enforcement. So it's not like they could end up going in there. And in fact, who closed down the Jungle Inn eventually?
Was liquor agents.
Was liquor control and the state fire marshal. Yeah. Because the Jungle Inn was one of those places that was, kind of added on to haphazardly. And, I know they didn't have inspectors come through. It was actually one of the reasons that the Beverly Hills Club fire in Kentucky in the 70s was so deadly, because, it was, for all intents and purposes, operating outside the law, at least at one point. And they had added on a bunch of buildings and didn't bring in, any kind of real code inspection. But the Jungle Inn was Hall's Corners was born out of a desire to have a liquor license for the Jungle Inn, and it turned out to be kind of untouchable by any other law enforcement agencies. So it operated on and off for, I'd say, about 15 years in the 30s and into the 40s, and it was an illegal gambling casino. I mean, you could play bingo there, you could play table games there, you could play slot machines there. My grandfather used to tell me stories about when he would go and gamble at the Jungle Inn. One of the stories he told is that he saw Dean Martin before he was Dean Martin, because Dino obviously was a Steubenville native, and he kind of made the rounds in the area, and he would come up and he would sing some songs, and then he would maybe deal some blackjack, which actually is something that he did in Las Vegas when they were filming Ocean's 11.
That's cool, man. That the memories some of those folks must have had. They probably didn't even know that they were talking to Dean Martin, because, as you said, he wasn't Dean Martin then. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool. And from everything I've seen in the research, that I've done, the little research, was the Jungle Inn was a huge moneymaker.
Oh yeah. Oh, it was enormous, and obviously it was enough for people to fight over, because that was one of the things. One of the theories, getting back to Jimmy Munsene, one of the theories for his death is that they killed him to kind of push him out of the picture when the Farr brothers came down from Cleveland to run the Jungle Inn.
The Farr brothers, these two twins from, they were Syrian, actually. They weren't even Italian.
Well, if you want to get technical, they were Lebanese, because, the Kingdom of Syria covered a lot of ground. Lebanon was not its own independent country until, I believe, 1923.
Got it. Okay, so these two twins come down from Cleveland to kind of, run the Jungle Inn for the mob interests, right? At some point, Jack Licavoli has a controlling interest of the Jungle Inn as well. I've come across reports that I think maybe it was either Cleveland Magazine or something. They were doing a big story on Licavoli, or when the mob kind of fell in Cleveland, and they said, excuse me, that Jack White Licavoli had made millions of dollars just from the Jungle Inn, and so that and I've also come across other stories that he was still pulling out in the late 70s, early 80s. He would still pull out sleeves of money that had the Jungle Inn stickers on them.
And and that's entirely possible, because the Farr brothers I think they got relatively light penalties for, fire code violations and liquor violations. But in the late 50s, they went on trial for tax evasion, and a lot of this came out.
Yeah.
And it was just ridiculous amounts of money in the 1930s and 40s. Like, it was estimated that they were making millions of dollars in revenue a year from this place.
And we're also told that
And this is when you could buy a new Chevy for $850.
Yeah. We're also told that Charlie Murgy, Charles and Bergia, Pittsburgh consigliere, Pittsburgh made mafia member, that he relocated to Warren to actually watch over the Pittsburgh family's cut or stake in the Jungle Inn as well. So that was around the I guess it would be the late 30s, early 40s that Charlie Murgy came into this area and settled in Warren. And so at that time, there's really no paperwork that says, who was the controlling stake.
They didn't file articles of incorporation for the Jungle Inn.
But it's widely believed that different people had different stakes in this casino, and eventually, after it got raided and got shut down, one of the Farr brothers actually, a few years later was maybe 10 years later or so was murdered, right?
Yes. The two brothers were Mike and John, and Mike was he lived in Warren, and he was out in his backyard chipping. I think he was going to go golfing that day.
Yeah.
And this car drove up and just shot him with a shotgun.
I believe that the house was on Kenmore, if I can remember.
Kenilworth.
There you go.
And it was, they found the car a little later on, and I believe the car came from police impound lot. I know the shotgun that was used to kill him was actually something that had been reported stolen from, I think, the Canton Police Department.
Wow, similarities with
Sandy's killing.
Sure.
Sandy Naples.
And of course, this was the early 60s, and at this point, another mob war is in full swing in the area.
Yeah.
Well, then too, if you talk about weapons coming up stolen from Canton Police Department, Canton Armory, some of those guns were traced to Cuba.
Yes, that's one of those things. I don't know if you guys watched The Irishman. I did. I actually read the book on which it was based. It's called I Heard You Paint Houses. Again, these are very interesting stories, but you're never quite sure of the veracity of any of them. And this was one of the things that Frank Sheeran said, that he was involved in the transportation of weapons down to Florida into the hands of a CIA guy named Howard Hunt, who would become famous as one of the Watergate conspirators a decade later, and they would be theoretically anyway used for the Bay of Pigs.
We've got a couple people in our Youngstown Mob Facebook group who are real heavy into the research of that whole thing of the guns down to Cuba. So if you guys are not a member of the Youngstown Mob group on Facebook, join. It's a private group. Over 31,000 people are in it.
It's free.
And, we share tons of information. Everybody shares something. They pictures, stories, old articles if they find them, anything like that. But we have a couple researchers in the group who are researching. What is it called, Jim? It's Operation Cuban Sunrise or something along those lines.
Something along those lines. Yeah, there's a lot of the Pittsburgh families involved in that. They actually caught. I want to say it was Kelly Manorino's son-in-law. He was actually on one of the planes that they had loaded guns onto in the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah.
And they realized when they took off that they didn't have enough fuel to get down to Florida. So they stopped in West Virginia. Well, the feds were watching them, and they caught them down in West Virginia and confiscated all these guns. They had 50 cals and all kind of weapons.
The thought
that
there
was part of the, moving all the guns down to Cuba.
Yeah, and the thought there was they were arming the rebels, right? Or they were arming. What were they doing in Cuba? Do you guys remember?
Here's the thing: Cuba was a great spot for organized crime to operate extra legally, but not necessarily illegally. I mean, there were stories of, and if you saw Godfather 2, they really kind of touched on this. When Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather and all of the movies that sprang from it, he did so from research. And if you know enough about organized crime history, you start to recognize who all these people are. But they talked about this at some length. There were these great, mob-run casinos in Cuba. under Batista. When Batista was overthrown and Castro came in and implemented a communist dictatorship, all of these casinos got seized. And so, the United States didn't like communism. They really didn't like communism in the Western Hemisphere. The mob didn't like any government where they couldn't get their end. So there was I don't want to say collaboration, but there was definitely a dovetailing of interests.
Yeah.
So, there was this idea, and there has been this idea for like the entirety of Castro's reign that they were going to, try and overthrow him and install somebody who wasn't a communist. And so the idea of the Bay of Pigs was they were going to foment this rebellion that would overthrow Castro. And like you said, they were getting weapons from a variety of sources.
Yeah, and this kind of ties into the connections between the mob and the CIA, right? It originally starts in World War II with
before it was even the CIA, it was the
right.
OSS at that point.
Exactly.
And they enlisted the mob to help keep the docks safe and working throughout World War II, because one of the ways the mob really cemented its control was in labor unions, particularly the Longshoremen's Union in New York.
And they used Lucky Luciano for a lot of that. And
that's why he got deported and didn't die in prison.
Right. And then he was even helping them, when they were moving troops up through Sicily, telling them what routes to take and which ways to go to avoid the Nazis.
Well, and of course, one of the things that Mussolini did when he came to power was crack down on the mafia. So again, this is an instance of, the mob and the United States government finding common cause.
Right.
So, there's so much there, and obviously maybe that's a whole nother Vice Squad episode for us, is the the Cuban Sunrise stuff. But, there's everybody always asks and wonders, did the mob have any part in killing JFK? Well, there's more stuff that comes out. I lean toward yes. Of course, there's all kinds of little coincidences as well. When you mention the Youngstown connections, in some of those old FBI files we have, there was Jack Ruby's sister and brother-in-law lived here in Youngstown, and he wrote them a letter, and it was all kinds of interesting little tidbits. But that's all stuff we can get into in a future episode. Again, the Vice Squad podcast is out there. First 6 episodes. We're going to bring you more. We just put 6 out there, and they've done pretty well. So check those out anywhere you get your podcasts. Of course, Vince, most people in the Youngstown Mob group and our fans are listening wherever, they're going to recognize the name Guerrieri. Okay.
I get that a lot.
So, there's in our research, the number one, kind of name we always come across with Guerrieri is a guy named Mario Guerrieri. Can you tell us who was Mario Guerrieri?
Mario was my grandfather's first cousin. That's the best short answer that I can come up with. There were we pretty much have our own page in the phone book in Youngstown. There are a lot of us, but my great grandfather and his brother came to. Well, first they ended up in coal country in southwestern Pennsylvania in Fayette County. Ended up in Youngstown in the late 20s, early 30s. And obviously kind of did their thing. Some things were more legal than others, I guess is the best way to put it. Again, my grandfather would tell me stories about, the people that he knew, like Doc Sawbones and Oxy the Bug and Sledgehammer Jerry. And that one's a real showstopper because, every time I talk about, my grandfather told me about Sledgehammer Jerry, everybody turns and looks at me and says, who's Sledgehammer Jerry?
We won't get into it today, but we will do definitely an episode of the Vice Squad podcast on Sledgehammer Jerry Pasquarella. That's an interesting story. Just one of those fascinating stories. But
right, and a surprising number of the stories that my grandfather told me checked out. But so anyway, that was my great grandfather's brother Paul. Paul was Mario's father. Paul was the father, and they both had huge families. My grandfather had 8 brothers and a sister. Mario, I want to say, was one of 7.
Wow.
So you know how it is in big Italian families at the turn of the century. And so obviously they were related. And to this day, I will get people who ask me if I'm related to Mario, and they are of a certain age, and they will then proceed to tell me what they were doing the night his house at the corner of 5th and Crandall blew up. It was a gas leak.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Whatever. So what were his kind of bigger known rackets or involvement in the
Well,
underworld?
he was a bondsman,
He
wasn't he?
was putatively a bail bondsman. Was involved in I think him and one of his brothers was involved in a counterfeiting ring in the 60s and early 70s. Probably the last thing he was known for is he went away for arson and related to the restaurant in Niles, and now I can't remember the name of it, that caught fire in the 90s.
There were a lot.
Yes, he went away for this one in particular.
Gotcha. There were. He definitely was one of the kind of usual suspects, if you will, that his name was mentioned a lot. Anytime there was something happening in Youngstown where the police were pulling guys in, questioning him, he was always on that list.
I think the big one you were talking about, I think it was like in the 60s, was they were counterfeiting, I believe it was money orders from the post office. They had stolen a bunch of money orders.
The kind of thing that will get the postal
Yeah.
inspectors involved.
Right.
Well, there you go. If you guys have any questions, if anybody's watching or listening right now, and you've got old memories of Mario Guerrieri, that you want to share, comment, send them to us, steelvalleysyndicate@gmail.com. We'll send them to Vince. We'll post everything, get everything out there. So I know there's people out there that have memories and stories, because we hear it a lot.
Absolutely.
So definitely reach out to us, send us whatever you have, and we'll definitely share it with Vince, and we'll put it online. And that's really kind of what the core of what we do anyway with that mob group, the Youngstown Mob. It's for people to share things. It's for research. It's for history. It's going walk down memory lane, but also just sharing things with public, with family members of these guys, anything like that. We highly encourage that. Vince, I got to think the mob is probably one of your favorite topics to talk about, just because you have such a great knowledge of it, the underworld, but also the other one is sports. You're so very knowledgeable about sports.
That's a really good segue.
Yeah, that's how I do it.
You're a pro, man.
Vince wrote a book called Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports.
Yes, and it is the longest book I've ever written.
Well, they've had a lot of weird moments up in Cleveland.
That is my point. But I was before we got to sit down, I was telling Johnny I actually just turned in a feature for the June issue of Cleveland Magazine about one of those weird moments in Cleveland sports. June is going to be the 50th anniversary of 10-cent beer night, which was just an absolute fiasco.
Really?
I was able to talk to a lot of people who were there. More is the point, a lot of people who remembered being there, because I kind of got the impression that there were certain people who were there and can't remember any of it.
I would imagine that.
I am actually going to a variety of talks about the 10-cent beer night. Most of them are in the Cleveland area, but June 20th, I'll be at the Tyler History Center in beautiful downtown Youngstown as part of their Bites and Bits series, just to talk about 10-cent beer night.
You should sell 50-cent beer cups there, and for inflation, marked up a little bit.
Well, what's really funny is original price in 1974 was 65 cents. So, a 10-cent beer actually seems like a bargain, but I'm not sure everybody understands how much of a bargain it actually was.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, if you wanna draw a crowd, you should advertise. Just put up posters that say 10-cent beer night. People will show up just thinking they're getting.
I was going to say, what kind of a crowd do you think I'd draw, though?
Oh yeah, the great readers of the world. I'm
because
sure.
that was the thing. One of the things that I was stunned to discover, and I feel like nobody else knows, is that nickel beer night, 10-cent beer night was actually a fairly common promotion in baseball at that point. And, because everybody says, oh my God, 10-cent beer night, how would people not know it was a bad idea? Because up until that point, it wasn't.
Yeah.
They would have these events, and, nothing of great consequence really happened, but it was just like a perfect storm of, because I can't tell you how many people I talked to for the story said, yeah, we had a really big crowd, and it wasn't the usuals, and nobody was there to watch the game.
So tell us about Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports, then the book. Where can people get it? What should people expect?
The book is published by Gray Publishing. They are a publisher of nonfiction books related to Northeast Ohio. All of Terry Pluto's most recent books have been Gray Publishing. Omar Vizquel's autobiography was Gray Publishing. There was a biography of Mike Hargrove a couple of years ago that was Gray Publishing. There's a biography of Joe Thomas that just came out that was Gray Publishing. But grayco.com, that's the publisher's website. I think they'll even sell you one that's autographed. And you can find it at most of your usual suspects, Barnes & Nobles, Amazon, wherever fine works of literature are sold.
And you're going to be here in the Valley soon to promote it as well, right?
Like I said, June 20th, I'll be there for 10-cent beer night, and I'm sure that they'll have copies of my book. The History Center always has. I'm actually going to be doing a talk next month in Niles at the McKinley Birthplace Museum. That's actually going to be organized crime related. How the Moaning Valley became Crimetown, USA.
What date is that?
April 13th at noon.
At noon at the McKinley Museum?
In Niles.
In Niles. So be there, everybody. Come meet Vince. Definitely check that out. Grab a book. Grab a couple books, because I guarantee you've got some Cleveland sports fans in your family or friends or family that you could share these books with. So great gifts for anybody. And you can get it signed too by the man himself.
I promise.
Yeah.
And Vince is a fantastic writer.
Absolutely. No, he's being modest.
He's being modest. He's
a great writer. He's just written a lot of different stuff. You could check out from, like you mentioned, books, magazines, now our podcasts, everything else. Kind of getting it out there, and it was a pleasure to work with you on the Vice Squad. We hope to do more here soon. And just thanks for coming in today.
It was my pleasure.
Jim, you got anything before we get out of here?
I just, I want to thank you for coming out. We always have a good time when we get together. I
try to have a good time wherever I go.
And I appreciate your writing, even though I'm not a Cleveland sports fan. I still appreciate it.
It takes all kinds.
Yeah, you're sitting in the middle of a Pittsburgh sports fan and a New York guy right now, sports fan.
I'll tell you, you know what the next book needs to be?
What's that?
We need to do one on Old Man Rooney and the gambling in Pittsburgh.
And it's funny you bring that up because there's a book called, and I know it's come up on the in the Facebook group, Interference. Dan Moldea.
Yeah.
He's actually an Akron guy. He's in DC now, but he's an Akron native, and he wrote at length about all of these gambling connections between the owners in the NFL and actually one of the things as a Browns fan I feel obligated to bring up, and that's one of the episodes that I wrote for the next season of the Vice Squad. We're going to talk about the Kefauver hearings when they came to Cleveland. One of the star witnesses for that was Mickey McBride, who was the original owner of the Cleveland Browns, and he was also let's say mob adjacent.
Yeah. That's a term I've been hearing a lot more lately. Mob adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and it's very hard for people who are, who do not do that research or are not of that era to understand just how pervasive organized crime was in urban life, really up until like the 60s or 70s. I mean, like I said, organized crime was into labor unions. There were all kinds of places where you can go and place a bet or get a card game going. They controlled various legitimate businesses. I mean, those are the guys who ran all the nightclubs, and it was just everywhere.
So where can people find you on social media if they want to check you out and follow you?
I am Vince Guerrieri on Twitter. I'm Vince Guerrieri in real life too, so that works out real well. Vince Guerrieri Books on Facebook. Find me, and that is a rundown of all of my varying events. I'm actually making a tour throughout northern Ohio, it feels like. I got a couple of stops in northwest Ohio, a lot of stuff in the Cleveland area, and occasionally I get down to Youngstown and Warren too.
Well, we are recording today from the studio here at Schaffen Career and Technical Center, where
yes, we are.
James is a professor here, a teacher, and anytime you're back in Youngstown, you're welcome to stop by.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Vince.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Vince.
Thanks.
All right, everybody. For my partner in true crime over there, Jimmy Naples, I'm Johnny Chechitelli. This was another episode of Youngstown Mob Talk. Like and subscribe, do all that fun stuff. Send us any comments, and we'll see you next time.
Ciao.
That was an amazing podcast from an amazing podcast company. If you enjoyed the show, please click the like and subscribe buttons and share it with your friends. It goes a long way in helping us produce more amazing content.